Welcome to Lesson 3, Legacies of Historical Globalization in Canada. In the previous two lessons, you examined the foundations and legacies of historical globalization on the world as early globalization began to take shape. In this lesson, we bring the focus on Canada. We attempt to answer the question, to what extent have the legacies of historical globalization affected Canada? All right, let's start with early Canada pre-European contact. Before the arrival of the British and French, Canada was inhabited by the first peoples who had arrived in Canada approximately 12,000 years prior to Europeans discovering the Americas. Over thousands of years, the first peoples migrated throughout North America and evolved into hundreds of nations within 6 different geographical regions of what we know today as Canada. Today, we refer to these hundreds of indigenous groups as the peoples of the First Nations. These First Nations formed trading relationships with each other, had their own systems of governments, and largely lived from hunting, gathering, and fishing from the land. They established complex cultures, languages, and traditions that go back thousands of years. Then, in 1497, John Cabot sailed to present-day Newfoundland and became the first explorer to claim land for Britain. The British were not interested in settling Newfoundland at that time, but instead were amazed by the vast wealth in fish and forests that Newfoundland had to offer. In 1535, French explorer Jacques Cartier ventured further inland up the St. Lawrence River into present-day Quebec and claimed that area for France. Again, Britain and France were not interested in permanent settlements at this point, but instead were interested in what Canada had to offer in its natural wealth. By the late 1500s, the wealthy elite in Europe started a fashion trend by wearing animal furs as hats and coats, and the fur industry in Europe was taking shape. In an effort to harvest fur pelts from animals such as the beaver, the French decided to establish a permanent settlement in Canada, led by Samuel de Champlain. In 1608, Champlain founded the colony of Quebec, and the French quickly began colonizing Canada. In 1627, the King of France granted land to the first freight trading company called the Company of New France. Not to be outdone, Britain decided to get in onto the fur trade too, and in 1670, Britain granted a charter to the Hudson's Bay Company, including a vast amount of land further inland west in Canada in what became known as Rupert's Land. By the end of the 1600s, the fur trade was well underway, with Britain and France both competing with each other. The role of the First Nations people in the fur trade was very much a trading partnership. The British and French relied on the First Nations to provide fur pelts in exchange for trading goods with them, such as metal tools, axes, cooking pots, foods, and guns. Contact between French fur traders and First Nations women resulted in children that had mixed European and First Nations ethnicity. Today we know them as the Métis. The relationship between the British and the French and the First Nations changed by the second half of the 1700s, when the British began its conquest of the French colony of New France. Britain and France fought over each other's colonial territory in the 7 Years' War from 1756 to 1763. In Canada, fighting during this war came to a head in 1759 at the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, where both French General Montcalm and British General Wolfe died in battle. In the end, the British won the 7 Years' War in 1763 and signed the Treaty of Paris, which stated that France gave up all of its mainland territory of New France to the British. Having achieved success in its conquest of North America, the King of Britain issued what was called the Royal Proclamation in 1763. The Royal Proclamation is a significant moment in Canada's history and the relationship between Europeans and First Nations in Canada. The Royal Proclamation was significant because it officially claimed all land and people living in Canada as belonging to the British Crown. The British believed that the First Nations people were nations that the British could have a relationship with, as one nation towards another. And as such, the British reserved land for the First Nations to live on, with an understanding that the land belonged to the British Crown. The Royal Proclamation set out the laws and relationships that still exist today between the federal government of Canada and First Nations people. Later, another significant event occurred that has shaped the relationship between English and French Canadians to this day. Following the Royal Proclamation, the British Crown had to choose to deal with French settlers in its new lands. They knew that French settlers were important to continuing the fur trade, but they didn't want them to rebel against British rule. So in 1776, the British issued the Quebec Act, which, in short, created the province of Quebec, allowed French settlers to keep speaking the French language and practicing the French culture and religion. The legacy of the Quebec Act can be seen throughout Canadian history as the beginning of the relationship between the two separate and distinct cultures existing within Canada, English and French. Things quickly changed again during the late 1700s and 1800s. American settlers in the 13 British colonies along the eastern seaboard of what we call the United States today fought for and won their independence in 1783, and the United States of America was born. As a result, thousands of British loyalists were forced to flee north to Canada, and the English speaking European population started to increase. Since there were more English than French in Canada, the British divided Canada into two separate colonies, Upper and Lower Canada. Upper Canada was inhabited mostly by the majority English speaking settlers, today forming what we call Ontario, and Lower Canada was inhabited mostly by the minority French speaking settlers, today what we call the province of Quebec. By the 1800s, the newly formed United States was threatening to invade British colonies of Canada, to which settlers in Canada, now becoming known as Canadians, were resisting. The War of 1812 saw Canadian settlers and First Nations in Canada fighting off the American invasion of Canada and ultimately defeating the Americans. The War of 1812 is significant as it united English, French, and First Nations in Canada to defend Canada from the aggression of the Americans, and is considered to be an early sign of the formation of a Canadian identity. By the mid 1800s, the British and French settlers in Upper and Lower Canada were demanding self government from the British Crown. A series of rebellions against British rule occurred in 1830 and 1831 in Upper and Lower Canada, and the colonists demanded their own responsible government and protection from future invasion from the Americans. So on July 1st, 1867, Canada was born in what we call Confederation. The first Constitution of Canada, the British North America Act, was passed by the British Crown, which established one nation of Canada with 4 provinces: Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. Canada was granted responsible government, and the first Prime Minister was John Macdonald. Immediately, Macdonald wanted to expand Canada further west into what was then known as the Northwest Territories. Most of Canada west of Ontario was still controlled by the Hudson's Bay Company. It was inhabited mostly by First Nations people and a smattering of European fur traders. Immediately, Macdonald encouraged immigrants from Britain to move to Western Canada with promises of free farmland in the West. Hundreds of thousands of British farmers and settlers moved westward, which immediately meant clashes with First Nations and Métis settlers, particularly in the area of the Red River Colony and what is today Manitoba. British settlers are moving in the newly granted Selkirk Grant in southern Manitoba. Land surveyors moved in and farms are created for British settlers. Métis settlers were being pushed out and, feeling their traditional way of life was being threatened, resisted British settlers. This led to what has been called the Red River Rebellion in 1869 and 1870. A group of Métis settlers led by Louis Riel, feeling threatened by the Canadian government surveyors, decided to create a provisional government at Red River and issued their demands to the Canadian government for the protection of Métis rights over land. Things got heated between the Métis and the British settlers as Riel and the Métis took over Fort Garry and arrested and imprisoned about 50 government surveyors. One outspoken Irish government surveyor who was arrested, named Thomas Scott, was very threatening and abusive to Riel and the Métis. As a result, Riel had Scott tried and executed. This prompted Canadian Prime Minister Macdonald to respond, and immediately Macdonald began negotiating with Riel's provisional government. In the end, Macdonald and the Métis agreed on the creation of Métis rights, and in 1870, a new province entered Confederation, Manitoba. However, Macdonald viewed Louis Riel as a criminal and blamed him for the execution of Thomas Scott. Macdonald ordered the arrest of Riel, but Riel escaped to the United States before he could be caught. John A. Macdonald not only wanted to open the West to British settlers, but he also envisioned a dream of a united Canada from the Atlantic to the Pacific Oceans. A new colony was emerging in the West called British Columbia, and in 1871, Macdonald promised them a national railway to unite BC with Ontario and Quebec, which Macdonald thought was essential to the creation of a unified Canadian nation that would stretch across the continent. The Canadian Pacific Railway began construction in 1881, starting in both BC moving east and Ontario moving west, and finished construction in 1885. However, to build a CPR, Macdonald saw the First Nations people, as well as the millions of buffalo that roamed the prairies, as obstacles to acquire land for the railroad and for farming settlements. Macdonald's solution was to create a series of treaties with the First Nations people in the West. Starting in 1871, the Canadian government negotiated 11 treaties with most of the First Nations in the Western Canada. The treaties, which were agreements between each First Nation and a British Crown, represented by the Canadian government, established agreements where the First Nations people agreed to share land with the government in exchange for a series of treaty rights for their people. These rights included land reserved for First Nations people, education, medicine, and hunting and fishing rights. The First Nations people considered these treaties sacred agreements for sharing land with the European settlers, as well as necessary to their survival due to the decline of the buffalo, which were being overhunted, as well as the devastating effects of smallpox and other diseases. The Canadian government also believed that treaties were significant, not only to the expansion and gaining of more territory, but also to a peaceful relationship with the First Nations people instead of a conquest by force. The treaties were signed in perpetuity, as they stated that they would last as long as the sun shines and the rivers flow. As the Canadian government was changing the West by building the railroad and signing treaties with the First Nations, the Métis again were experiencing hardships by the late 1800s. The Métis were being forced out of Manitoba and into Saskatchewan by European immigration. Promises to protect Métis rights were not being honored by the Canadian government, and again the Métis found their way of life threatened. Métis leaders like Gabriel Dumont were organizing another resistance to the government's expansion west, and in 1884, Louis Riel returned to Canada from the United States to help organize a resistance. This resulted in the 1885 Northwest Rebellion. Louis Riel, Gabriel Dumont, and other Métis leaders wrote a petition to the Canadian government to honor its promise of Métis rights. And in March 1885, they created a provisional government at Batoche, Saskatchewan, with an armed militia and demanded the surrender of a Hudson's Bay Company post at Fort Carleton. The rebellion spread among First Nations and Métis people, and a series of battles and events, such as the Frog Lake Massacre and battles at Cut Knife, Battleford, and Batoche, would result in the Métis surrender to the Northwest Mounted Police. A number of First Nations and Métis leaders were arrested and imprisoned, and some were executed. Louis Riel was famously put on trial in Regina, and on November 16, 1885, Louis Riel was hanged for treason. While the Canadian government was signing treaties with First Nations people, the Canadian government also had other plans to assimilate First Nations people into British Canadian society with the Indian Act. Passed by the Canadian government in 1876, the Indian Act created the legal framework which officially made the Canadian government responsible for the welfare of the First Nations people. The original Indian Act law in 1876 was created with a Eurocentric attitude, meaning that the Canadian government treated First Nations people with a sense of paternalism. They treated them as if they were children and needed being protected. The Indian Act created regulations upon First Nations people, such as the creation of treaty status, which recognizes who was and who wasn't considered to be Indian. The Act identified people by their Indian status and belonging to bands and organized them into band councils. The band councils were made dependent on the Canadian government, as the government gave each council a certain amount of money every year that the council had to run the band. Many First Nations people lost their legal Indian status depending on which government bureaucrat was responsible for them. For example, a First Nations man or woman would lose their legal status if they married someone who was non-First Nations, or if they moved off reserve, or if they wanted to vote in a federal election. The Indian Act also restricted First Nations people's movements on reserves and established a restrictive pass system where First Nations people had to ask for permission just to move around or leave the reserve. Furthermore, traditional First Nation ceremonies and traditions, such as the sacred sun dance and the potlatch traditions, were considered by the Canadian government as primitive and backwards, and were banned by law. Since its original legislation in 1876, the Canadian government has changed the Indian Act to be less restrictive to First Nations people. However, the Indian Act still exists today, and many consider it to be a major obstacle towards fixing the problems faced by many poor and suffering reserves in Canada today. Another much more significant attempt by the Canadian government to assimilate First Nations people in Canada was a residential school system. As the Indian Act placed a government responsible for the welfare of First Nations people, John A. Macdonald's government created a residential school system for First Nations children with the purpose of removing their First Nations language, culture, and identity, and replacing it with British or French language, culture, and European identity. Starting in 1884, schools were built across Canada in areas with First Nations populations. Children were forced to leave their families from the ages of 5 to 18 and attend a residential school, sometimes hundreds or even thousands of miles away from their families. The schools were funded by the Canadian government, but ran by the Catholic, Protestant, or other Christian churches in Canada. Priests, nuns, and teachers taught children how to read and write in English and French, as well as European history, farming or housekeeping skills, and many other things deemed necessary by the government. Children's hair was cut short. They were given modern clothing instead of their own clothes, and they were punished for not following the rules. They were punished harshly for speaking their own language or practicing their own culture in school. Thousands of First Nations children were exposed to brutal physical, verbal, emotional, and sexual abuse by teachers and clergy members in schools across Canada. Towards the mid-1900s, the Canadian government provided less funding to the schools and relied on churches to operate them on their own. Generations of children experienced starvation and abuse due to lack of proper funding and teacher training. By the 1970s and 1980s, the Canadian government slowly began closing the schools as they started to see within First Nations communities that children who graduated from the schools and returned to their communities were not integrating properly as they'd hoped. Many were turning to drugs and alcohol to deal with the pain and trauma they experienced in residential schools. The abuse was being passed down from one generation to another, and the last school closed in 1996 in Saskatchewan. The legacy of residential schools and the Indian Act started to affect the rest of Canada slowly starting in the 1990s and continues in Canada today. A series of violent armed standoffs with a number of First Nations of land took place across Canada. Social issues in First Nations communities, such as high rates of crime, alcohol and drug abuse, gangs, homelessness, and other problems were becoming visible across Canada. The Canadian government investigated these issues in First Nations communities in 1996 with the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. The Royal Commission report stated that the Canadian government was responsible for problems facing First Nations communities, as they were largely the result of negative attempts to assimilate First Nations people. As a result, in 2008, the Canadian government, led by Stephen Harper, issued a formal apology on behalf of the Canadian government to all First Nations people who were survivors of residential schools. That same year, the Canadian government established the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was established to uncover the truth about the schools. The commission gathered statements from residential school survivors through public and private meetings at various local, regional, and national events across Canada. 7 national events were held between 2008 and 2013, and they commemorated the experiences of former students in residential schools. In 2015, the TRC concluded with the establishment of the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation and the publication of a multi-volume report detailing the testimonies of survivors and historical documents from the time. This report also recommends 94 calls to action for Canadian society to address the issues created by residential schools and to begin the process of reconciliation in Canada.